There are three things a person cannot avoid in Elkridge, Montana: death, winter, and Mrs. Abigail Crane. I had been putting off the supply run for 2 days, which was 2 days longer than the flour bin could afford. But I knew, the way you know a storm is coming by the ache in your knees, that the moment I set foot in Perkins' General Store, I would be walking into an ambush. Mrs. Crane had the nose of a bloodhound and the patience of a woman who had nothing better to do than know everyone else's business, and by now she had certainly heard that Emmett Hale had ridden back into the valley. I saddled my mare and rode into town under a sky the color of old silver, with the aspens throwing gold coins across the road, and the air carrying that particular October sharpness that makes you pull your color up and ride a little faster. Elkridge is not much of a town. A single road with buildings on both sides, a church at one end, a livery at the other, and Perkins' General Store sitting squarely in the middle like a spider in its web. Everyone passes through Perkins eventually. That is what makes it dangerous. I tied my horse to the rail out front and took a breath, the way a soldier takes a breath before a charge. Then I pushed through the door. Mrs. Crane was exactly where I expected her to be, which was leaning against the counter with a cup of something steaming and a look on her face that said she had been waiting for me specifically. She was a tall woman, thin as a fence rail, with sharp gray eyes and a mouth that never quite stopped moving. She wore her hair pinned up tight and her opinions pinned up not at all. "Clara Dawson, as I live and breathe," she said, which was the way she started every conversation, as though my existence surprised her each time. "I was just saying to Mr. Perkin this morning that I hadn't seen you in a week, and I hoped you weren't coming down with something." "Just busy," I said, reaching for the flour sack on the shelf behind her, with what I hoped was an air of cheerful disinterest. "The south pasture fence needed mending." Mrs. Crane's eyes sharpened like a hawk spotting a rabbit in tall grass. "The south pasture," she repeated. "That would be the fence you share with the Hale property, wouldn't it?" I could have lied. I could have said it was the north fence or the corral gate or any of the dozen other things on a ranch that are always in need of repair. But Mrs. Crane had a way of catching lies like a spider catches flies, and struggling only made it worse. "It would," I said. "Well," Mrs. Crane set her cup down and folded her hands together, and I knew with absolute certainty that the next 5 minutes of my life were not my own. "Then I suppose you've seen that the Hale boy is back." "I may have noticed. Rode in last Tuesday on that gray gelding of Henry's. Reverend, I believe the horse is called, though why anyone would name a horse after a clergyman is beyond my understanding." She paused just long enough to let me know that the pause was deliberate. "They say he's been back east. Philadelphia, or was it Boston? Studying something impractical, no doubt. He looked thin. City thin, not sick thin, if you take my meaning." I took her meaning. I took all of her meanings, because Mrs. Crane never offered just one. "I didn't get a close look," I said, which was not entirely true. Mrs. Crane picked up her cup again and took a sip that somehow communicated deep skepticism. "Well, I heard from Dolly Perkin, who heard from the boy who delivers the mail, that he's been trying to fix up that barn of Henry's, hammering at all hours. Apparently, he doesn't know which end of the nail to hit." I pressed my lips together to keep from smiling, because I had seen the barn from the ridge, and the new boards were crooked enough to confirm this report entirely. "I don't know what Henry Hale is thinking, sending for that boy after all these years," Mrs. Crane continued, warming to her subject. "The ranch is half fallen down. Henry can barely get out of his chair, and he sends for a son who's been reading books in a city parlor. What's the boy going to do? Recite poetry to the cattle?" "Maybe the cattle would appreciate it," I said. "Lord knows Duchess could use some culture." Mrs. Crane waved this away. "Mark my words, Clara, that boy won't last the winter. He'll be back east before the first real snow, and Henry Hale will be right where he started, sitting alone in that house with nobody but his stubbornness for company." I wanted to argue, which surprised me, because I had no earthly reason to defend Emmett Hale, but I had seen him at the fence line, and whatever else he was not a man who had come to Elkridge on a whim. There had been something in his face when he handed Duchess back through the gap in the rails, something set and quiet that did not belong to a man planning to leave. I kept this observation to myself, because sharing it with Mrs. Crane would have been like tossing a match into dry hay. I was measuring out sugar and thinking I might escape with my dignity when Billy Ketchum walked in. Billy worked for us 3 days a week, and for whoever else needed a hand, the other 4. He was built like a young ox, cheerful as sunshine and blessed with absolutely no sense of when to keep his mouth shut. "Morning, Miss Clara," he said, pulling off his hat and grinning the way Billy always grinned, which was with his entire face. "Morning, Mrs. Crane. Fine day, isn't it?" "It's October, Billy," Mrs. Crane said. "It is the same as every other October." Billy was not discouraged. Billy was never discouraged. It was his gift and his curse. He turned to me with a look of genuine excitement and said, "Say, Miss Clara, you know that Hale fellow, the one that just came back?" My stomach tightened. "I've heard the name. I saw him yesterday trying to round up a heifer that got loose near the creek," Billy said, leaning against the counter with the ease of a man about to deliver what he believed was excellent entertainment. He chased that cow for a solid hour. Up through the brush, down the bank, across the shallows, back up the other side. The cow won every single round. Mrs. Crane's eyes were gleaming. I could feel the gossip being cataloged in real time. And the best part, Billy continued, utterly unaware that he was providing ammunition to the most dangerous woman in Elkridge, is that he finally got her cornered against the old log fence, and she just stepped right over it. Stepped over it like it wasn't even there. And he stood there looking at that fence like it had personally betrayed him. Billy laughed, a big open sound that filled the store. I felt bad for the fellow, honestly. He looked like a man who'd been told the rules and then found out the rules don't apply to cows. I bit my inside cheek hard enough to taste copper. The image was too precise, too perfectly pathetic, and if I laughed, Mrs. Crane would read the laughter like a page in a book I did not want her reading. "Thank you, Billy," I said, in a voice as level as I could manage. "I'm sure Mr. Hale is settling in just fine." "Oh, sure," Billy said, nodding agreeably. "He seems like a decent sort, just doesn't know much about cows yet. But who does, really, when you think about it? Cows are mysterious creatures." Mrs. Crane stared at Billy for a long moment, then shook her head and returned her attention to me. "Your father must have thoughts about the Hale boy being back," she said, and the lightness in the room shifted just a shade. "My father has thoughts about everything," I said. "He keeps most of them to himself." "He always did." Mrs. Crane's voice had changed, gone softer, and there was something in her eyes that I could not quite name. She opened her mouth, and what came out started as one thing and ended as another. "Your mother and Henry," she began, and then she stopped. She stopped the way a horse stops at the edge of a cliff, sudden and complete, as though she had seen the drop just in time. I waited. The store was quiet, except for Billy examining a jar of peppermints on the far shelf. Mrs. Crane picked up her cup again and took a long sip. "Well," she said briskly, "that was a long time ago. Water under the bridge, as they say. How much sugar did you need, dear?" I told her. She measured it out. We talked about the weather and the price of sark pork and whether Reverend Holloway's sermons were getting longer or whether it just felt that way. But the half-sentence sat between us on the counter like something that had been set down and could not be picked back up, and Mrs. Crane did not meet my eyes again until I was halfway to the door. I loaded the supplies into the saddlebags and stood for a moment in the thin October sunlight, watching the town go about its business. 2 men talking outside the livery, a dog sleeping in the dust, the church steeple catching the light at its tip like a candle just lit. Elkridge was the kind of place where nothing much happened and everyone had an opinion about it anyway, and on most days I found that comforting. On most days, I liked being known, being placed, being Clara Dawson from the Dawson Ranch on the east side of the valley. But Mrs. Crane had started to say something about my mother and Henry Hale, and then she had stopped, and the stopping was louder than anything she could have said. My mother, who had died in the winter of '88 with a fever that took her in 3 days and left a silence in our house that 6 years had not filled. My mother, whom my father spoke about with tenderness and brevity, as though her memory were something precious and fragile that too many words would break. My mother and Henry Hale, in the same sentence, spoken and then swallowed. I rode home slowly, letting the mare pick her own pace along the valley road. The aspens burned gold and red against the dark pines, and the mountains stood patient and enormous against the October sky, the way they always did, as though nothing that happened in the valley below was of any real consequence to them. I passed the turn where the road bends south toward the Hale property, and I did not look, because looking would have meant thinking, and thinking would have meant asking questions I was not sure I wanted answered. My father was on the porch when I rode in, sitting in the chair he always sat in, watching the valley the way he always watched it, as though he were standing guard against something only he could see. I waved. He raised his hand. I put the supplies away and started supper, and did not mention Mrs. Crane or the thing she almost said, because some silences in our house were old enough to have earned their place, and I was not yet brave enough to disturb them. But that night, after my father had gone to bed and the house was quiet, and the only light was the lamp I kept burning in the kitchen window, I stood at the glass and looked out across the dark valley toward the Hale property. There was a light burning there too, small and distant, like a star that had fallen and gotten caught in the hills. Somebody was awake over there. Somebody was sitting up late, the same as me, in a house full of silences they did not understand. I turned the lamp down and went to bed, and I dreamed of nothing I could remember in the morning, which was probably for the best.